My name's Earlow Costine. I'm 76 and a half years old, born in 1947. Born here in Lakeland, Florida, Polk County. I've been in the cow business for 76 years, at least. I was drafted in 1968, in the spring of 1968. I stayed in the military for almost a year and 3/4. I got out the last part of 1969. I stayed in the States the first year I was in the military, training. And when I went to Vietnam, I was in 1969. I was through training troops, and I was making sure the troops was listening to what I had for them to say. It was a challenge, but I learned a lot through the military. A lot of respect, a lot of love for my country, more than I ever had probably. It was a blessing when I went in the military. It was hard for me because I'd never been out of Polk County. And just to leave home and be thrown across the ocean somewhere, it was a great experience, but it was a trying experience also.
Do you think all your years of cow hunting and ranching helped you in the military?
My years of living in the woods, cow hunting, ranch work, yes. I felt like when I was put in a position where I had to know where I was at, because when you're in the woods and cow hunting, you had to know where you was at, you had to know where you were going, you had to know your rendezvous points where you needed to be at a certain time, or event of the final time you needed to be back at your pens. But in the military, I think it was a tremendous help for me through them years that I was ranching and cowboying, that to realize that in the military, if you don't know where you're at, you call in fire protection or something, you may kill your own buddies, you know. So it was very important, and I learned a lot. Experience being a woodsman, being a rancher, being a cowboy in my early years. So yes, it was a great help to me.
Coming up, what was your predominant type of cattle?
Well, we have Brahma bulls, of course, crossbred bulls, mostly Brahma bulls, just kind of half scrub, just old common everyday cracker, not really cracker cows, but they were just kind of crossed up with scrub, and of course through the breeding of the Brahma, you got a little better quality, and it kind of went along that way for several years. And probably in 1958, my daddy bought a shorthorn bull and a Hereford bull. The Hereford bull turned out to be a good asset to our cattle industry. The shorthorn bull went to a water hole and stood there and starved to death. Never got a calf out of him. But I probably, till this day, probably got some blood still from that Hereford bull. And of course, from there on, it kind of just fizzled out, and the Hereford bull wore out, and we've had the Hereford bull for years after that. And then, of course, my daddy died in 1962, and we had the woods full of Hereford calves, bull yearlings, and some good crossbred heifers out of them, just common crossbred cows.
What's the biggest changes that you've seen in the cattle industry?
Well, I've seen a lot of changes. Of course, back in that time, in my early years, most everywhere you went was all rough woods. It wasn't improved pastures. Probably in the late 50s, people started improving land to where they could carry more cows. The biggest change is in 1958, the screwworms was eradicated, and that was a big change in the cattle industry. That's one of the greatest things the Cattlemen's Association come up with, to turn them sterile flies loose, and for the rancher would have more time to contend with other things other than just doctoring screwworms. But that was a big change in the cattle industry.
ride dog first one. He ain't got no bite though.
Well, that's all right. That old gator dog I had, he wouldn't have no bite, but he'd stay with you.
Well, a good dog on the ground's worth three in the saddle, no matter where you're from. Been many good dog was a friend to a man, but Sam was the greatest one. He was a hound of hounds, he was a wonder of all dogs.
What do you say your best dog was, and what do you look for in a good cow dog?
Yeah, I've had dogs all my life, and I think they're very important in the cattle industry. I know today a lot of people don't, but all my life I've kind of was raised with cows that had dog broke. I've had a lot, probably hundreds of head of dogs I've raised, and as far as to name one, I couldn't really name one that specifically, but I wanted a dog that, especially back in rough woods days, that you could find a trail or a cow where they went and put him on it, and he'd go to them and bunch them and circle them. I never liked a catch dog. I liked the dog that would go to the cows and bay them up, bunch them up, and circle them and just work them out of the way. I didn't like a catch dog. My daddy always told me if I couldn't hold her up and drive her, I didn't need to own her.
Say that, baby. Hey.
My mark and brand is very distinct. My daddy, like I told you in the earlier part of this, that he gave me a calf the year I was born. And he had his own mark and brand. It depended on the age group, I guess, of the older down to the youngest. I'm sure one day he kind of thought, well, I may run out of marks and brands. But his mark was crop 200 bits underbit. And so he gave me my mark. It was crop 200 bits in the right ear. His was crop 200 bits underbit. So he put an underbit and an upper bit. That was my mark. And some of my rest of my family had like crop 200 bit, underbit, upper bit, swallow fork, crop 200 bit, upper bit. And the brand that I've used today, I used a lot of brands off and on throughout my career. But I finally, after years and years, my granddaddy had a brand called the Half Moon brand. It was shaped like the moon sitting in the sky, and some of my older families, uncles and aunts, they didn't want me to have it, but I wound up and I had to change it from a half moon to a quarter moon brand to get it registered. But actually the brand, if you look at it, you'd call it more of a quarter of a moon than you would a half moon anyway. So that's the way it was registered, as a quarter of a moon. But my granddaddy would be a half moon, and I've done some before, but he would black brand on the growing of the moon and set that brand on the cow's side, and it would just grow the whole side. The cow would be covered in that brand. It would just grow from her hips to her shoulders in the growing of the moon. And a lot of people don't believe in that, the growing of the moon or how the moon shines, but the moon shines means a lot. But at times you can brand one and it will never grow a bit, and then at times you can brand them and it'll grow bigger and bigger. In my day working and working for other folks, some of my stories was how they operated, how they went about gathering cattle. I worked for several big places in my life in my younger days. You had to kind of know kind of where the cattle were hanging, or you had to know where you were going. I worked for Rudolph Dorman at Cummers for several summers, and I liked the way he gathered woods cows. We would start in a pasture and go and head out, and we'd gather a little handful and bunch them up, and 2 or 3 people would take them and go to driving them, and when the rest of us would go ahead and find another bunch. And that was very impressive to me. Now when you go together a bunch, you go out there and they're in a grass field, maybe 100, 200 acres, and you send the dogs to them and they bunch up and you're back in the cow pen in 15 minutes. But at that time, you'd drive maybe 100 head of cows all day before you come back to the cribs that night. That goes back to your dogs. You had to have dogs that you could control that wasn't real mouthy, because when you got your first bunch together, you went to hunting the next bunch, you didn't want them dogs aggravating them cows and barking and scaring. You didn't talk loud in the woods. You just kind of eased along with the cows and rode them. I learned a lot about that from that experience. So I have worked with some people that you just rode out there and circled them and got them in a dead run and run them to the pens. And I didn't like that kind of operation. I want to. It's like driving a car. I want to be in control of it when I'm out there gathering a bunch of cows. I don't want them just out there on their own. And that's the same way with a car. You get in a car and you don't drive it, you're going to run over something. And calamities happen with a cow bunch. But I worked for Willie Akins, and he didn't use dogs. His old cattle, he could go to popping his whip and hollering, and they'd go to coming out of them old marshes and bunch up and their own. And then you just rode around them and drove them. They were gentle. When I leased the P-Atlas under that lease and went out there with Julius Albritton, he helped me get the lease. It was one big pasture, had a little hold up, but it was all open woods and all open swamp woods, no cross fences, not like today. Today, most of the pastures, you got cross fences, separate pastures, but out there it was 16,000 acres of just nothing but rough woods and old fields that had been maybe farmed and done away with, but 90% of it was rough woods. Those were probably the most memorable years of my life, most challenging years of my life with that lease out there in the P-Atlas, because I started out with nothing, and the Lord blessed me through that. Had a lot of tragedies come along, different things in the cattle industry, liver flukes, pink eye, scours, just you name it, it happened to me out there. But I survived, and I kept going forward. I never slowed down, and you could take a horse out there and get him to going, and in about 3 or 4 days you could have him where you could pin a cow on him. You could ride him enough that you didn't have to worry about him bucking you off. And I did a lot of that gathering out there with my son and I at dark. I'd go out there, ride at dark, and most people want to be home in the bed or eating supper at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. But most of the time I'd load up at 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon and head to the woods. And I'd go out there with him, and all them cattle would be out on them ridges or out on a sandy spot in the road or something, or fighting deer flies, and you could bunch them up, and you can drive a cow at dark easier than you can in the daytime. But the cows were dog broke, and it was a challenge that I went there and done that, but for 15 years, it was rewarding. It got better and better every year as far as raising good calves, and it was a blessing. That place was, yeah. I just wish today that my grandson and the younger generation had places like that to experience gathering cattle and riding and going and doing. Years ago, you could go most cypress swamps and cut a heart post, find them pretty easy until they cut all the cypress out. Most people back 40 years ago, they wasn't a supply that they are today, like fence posts. You could pick up a few fence posts here and there that had been treated, but they were hard to come by. So you had to use what you had. I know when my daddy built this fence here around this place, when he bought it in 1944, he went through the woods, and back then they was lighted limbs laying from the tops of the pines that they had cut, and they was lighted. They'd be crooked like a snake, but he'd pick them posts up on them ridges and flatwoods and use them for fence posts until he got to the Cypress Pond, and then he'd cut heart posts and put them in. I have, from the day to the back them days, I worked for different ones and built a little fence for them. I never got into it at a major fence job, and I have at times, like say, cut enough posts, and it takes about 110 posts for a quarter of a mile of 4-strand fence. Cut the posts, tote them out, and put them on a truck and haul them out there and put them in a fence and string 4 wires in a day by myself. I've done that several times. That's why I'm in the shape I'm in today. I worked from Livestock Market from 1971 to, I don't know what year I finally gave it up, but there was a lot of changes from then till now. The best part of my market career, it wasn't the work, because it was hard work, stress work, but the best part of my years that I got to meet so many cow people and I learned a lot from seeing the calves from different ones. This man would bring in a set of calves and they'd be awesome. The next man would bring in just common calves that was raised 50 years ago. And like I say, I got to meet so many good people. Even back when in the midstream of my career there at the market, you know, we could have 3,000 head. I worked Tampa and I worked Lakeland. Lakeland, you could have 1,500 head in Tampa and get home at 4 o'clock in the morning, go back to Lakeland and work till Wednesday afternoon with 3,000 head. Tampa finally completely just dried up because of development. Dairies went out of business. The ranchers they sold their land. The younger generation didn't want to have to work. So when they inherited the land, the cow, they got rid of it and sold it off and enjoyed the money. Lakeland's kind of went that way. There's a need for a market. There's a lot of changes in the cattle industry, like Superior and like Okeechobee. They got that sale that they do, and Country Cattle Page, and so many people has went to that some of your bigger cow people, but there's still a need for that livestock market. But I don't think it's dried up. It's dried up a lot from 20 years ago, from 3,000 head this time of the year to 500. That's a big change in the cattle industry. It ain't necessarily because people are all selling them on Superior or Country Page or loading them load lots. It is caused some conflict with that, but they just so many people, the local people here in Polk County and the surrounding counties, it sold their land, or either they had a land lease and it sold off and put houses on it. So it goes back to the development, I think, has caused a lot of that. I learned a lot. I did a lot of hard work for that place, and graded cattle and made sure everybody's cattle got in the right pens, and made sure everybody's cattle got sold the right way. Made sure they got loaded out, and there was boo-boos. Everybody makes mistakes. And it happened every week somewhere. They'd be somebody open the wrong gate or let somebody else would get mixed up. But I thank the Lord for that, because I was blessed enough. I had enough cow sense, and I'd been there long enough around cattle that I knowed about everybody's cattle in Polk County. I could look at a calf and say he come from Jim Johnson, or he come from Old Man Kirkland, or just I could look at a cow and tell her where she come from most of the time. And that made it easier for me to go in there and part them calves out if something did get mixed up. It was an experience working there, but it just, it was tiring. It wore me down. And them all-nighters and all days, and I finally had to give it up. But I did enjoy every minute of it. I worked my heart out when I was there.
On a warm summer's evening, on a train bound for nowhere, I met up with a gambler. We were both too tired to sleep, so we took turns of staring out the window at the darkness till boredom overtook us, and he began to speak. He said, "Son, I've made a life out of reading people's faces and knowing what the cards were by the way they held their eyes. So if you don't mind my saying, I can see you're out of aces.